On a chilling morning in 1601, Robert Devereux mounted the scaffold clad in black velvet, awaiting the fall of the axe within the private walls of the Tower of London. This execution was not reserved for a foreign invader, but for the man who was once the Queen's most cherished favorite, a man who had gambled his life on a rebellion destined to fail. It was the catastrophic collapse of the brightest, yet most painfully extinguished star of the Tudor dynasty. Before the axe fell, he had been the kingdom's most arrogant figure, the only one who dared to sulk at the Queen and treat the royal chambers with the casual familiarity of his own kitchen. With noble blood in his veins, and the London crowds roaring his name like a god, Robert believed himself untouchable, an uncrowned king. Yet, it was this very delusion of power and nothing else that single-handedly drove England's golden boy into this bloody dead end. He entered the world on November 10th, 1565, at Netherwood in Herefordshire. The mid-1560s were a time of stabilization for Elizabeth's reign, but for the Devereux family, life was a constant navigation of high stakes and dangerous liaisons. His towering arrogance and sense of invincibility stemmed directly from his mother, Lettice Knollys. Lettice was not merely a noblewoman, she was royalty in all but name. Her grandmother was Mary Boleyn, the sister of Anne Boleyn. This meant that Lettice was the grandniece of Anne Boleyn, and her son, Robert, was the Queen's first cousin, twice removed. The physical resemblance between the Devereux line and the Queen was often remarked upon. They shared the same reddish-gold hair, the same pale skin, the same long, aquiline noses, and, most dangerously, the same fiery, ungovernable temper. The Boleyn blood was a potent vintage. It produced people who were magnetic, intelligent, and utterly incapable of backing down. Robert's father was Walter Devereux, the first Earl of Essex. Walter was a man of the old school, a warrior, a crusader, a man who believed that nobility was defined by martial prowess. He was the antelope of the heraldic crest, strong and steadfast. But he was also a man consumed by the impossible task of taming Ireland. When Robert was just a boy, his father was absent, fighting in the bogs and forests of Ulster. The young Robert was raised in a household dominated by his mother, Lettice. She was one of the most beautiful women of the age and arguably the most ambitious. She was dubbed the She-Wolf, a label often whispered by the Queen herself. She taught Robert that he was special, that he was destined for greatness, and that the Devereux name was second to none. In 1576, tragedy struck. Walter Devereux died in Dublin. The official cause was dysentery, the Irish flux. But whispers of poison traveled across the Irish Sea faster than the news of the death itself. The death of the father is the first pivotal trauma in the life of the hero. Robert, now the second Earl of Essex at the age of 10, became a ward of the crown. This was a peculiar Tudor institution where noble orphans were taken in by the state to ensure their loyalty and the proper management of their estates. Robert was sent to live in the household of Lord Burghley, William Cecil. This was the center of power. Cecil was the Queen's Secretary of State, the architect of her government, the man who ran England. The young Robert Devereux, filled with the martial dreams of his warrior father and the fiery pride of his Boleyn mother, was suddenly dropped into the quiet, studious, bureaucratic household of the Cecils. Burghley was a man of peace, of ledgers, of careful diplomacy. Young Robert was a boy of war. He was brilliant, a prodigy, in fact. He matriculated at Trinity College, Cambridge, at the age of 12 and received his Master of Arts by 14. He could write fluent Latin and Greek. He was obsessed with history, particularly the lives of Roman generals. He saw himself as a young Caesar in waiting. But even at Burghley's house, The cracks in his character were visible. He spent money he didn't have. He refused to wear anything but the finest clothes. He was haughty to the servants and dismissive of Burleigh's own son, Robert Cecil. Robert Cecil was a hunchback, physically frail, quiet, and Machiavellian. Robert Devereux was tall, athletic, loud, and charismatic. They grew up in the same house, learning the same lessons, but they were destined to become the twin poles of Elizabethan politics, the warrior and the politician. Their childhood rivalry would eventually tear England apart. However, the event that truly defined Robert's life and sealed his doom was a marriage that happened while he was still a boy. After his father died, his mother Lettice Knollys did the unthinkable. She began an affair with Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Dudley was the sweet Robin of the Queen's youth. He was the only man Elizabeth had ever truly considered marrying. Their relationship was the emotional anchor of the Queen's life. For 20 years, Elizabeth had kept Dudley by her side, preventing him from marrying anyone else, keeping him in a state of suspended romantic animation. Lettice Knollys broke the spell. She didn't just sleep with the Queen's favorite, she married him. They married in secret in 1578. When the news finally leaked out a year later, the Queen's rage was apocalyptic. She felt betrayed on every level. Her cousin, Lettice, had stolen her lover, Dudley. Elizabeth banished Lettice from court forever. She famously boxed Lettice's ears and screamed that there was only one queen in England. But here is the twist. While the Queen hated the mother, she became fascinated by the son. By marrying Dudley, Lettice had made Robert Devereux the stepson of the most powerful man in the realm. Robert Dudley had no legitimate heirs of his own. He looked at young Robert Devereux and saw the son he never had. He took the boy under his wing. He introduced him to the military arts. He paid his debts. He groomed him. So when Robert Devereux finally arrived at court in 1584, aged 18, he wasn't just another nobleman. He was a phenomenon. He was the son of the martyr warrior Walter Devereux. He was the stepson of the great favorite Leicester. He was the cousin of the Queen. He was a prince in all but title. The court that Robert entered in the mid-1580s was a place of dazzling surface beauty and rotting foundations. To the outside world, this was the Gloriana years. England was rising. The arts were flourishing. Exploration was expanding the map. But inside the palaces of Whitehall, Greenwich, and Richmond, the atmosphere was growing stale. Queen Elizabeth was 51 years old when Essex arrived. In the 16th century, this was old age. The young, vibrant princess who had danced the La Volta was gone. In her place was a woman fighting a desperate battle against time. She had begun to construct the mask of youth. Her face was painted with ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, to hide the wrinkles and smallpox scars. The lead slowly poisoned the skin, turning it gray, requiring more makeup, creating a vicious cycle. Her teeth were black and rotting from her addiction to sugar, leading her to stuff rags in her mouth to pad out her sunken cheeks. She wore elaborate red wigs to hide her thinning gray hair. She was a brilliant, terrifying, lonely woman surrounded by sycophants who told her she looked like a goddess of 20. Into this world walked Robert Devereux. He was 18. He was breathless with vitality. He was everything the court lacked. He was authentic, impulsive, and radiantly alive. The attraction was immediate. It was not initially a sexual attraction in the crude sense. It was a psychological hunger. Elizabeth looked at Essex and saw her own lost youth. She saw the Boleyn fire that she had been forced to suppress for the sake of survival. She saw the same swagger that her father, Henry VIII, had possessed. And Essex? What did he see? He saw a path to power. He was young, but he was not naive. He knew that in England, all blessings flowed from the Virgin Queen. To control the Queen was to control the state. He began a courtship that was bizarre to behold. He played the role of the devoted lover. He wrote her sonnets. He wore her colors. He danced with her for hours, pretending not to notice her black teeth or her bad breath. He treated her not as a sovereign, but as a difficult, demanding mistress, and she loved it. By 1587, the Earl of Leicester was aging and frequently ill. He pushed his stepson forward almost as a replacement for himself. Essex was appointed Master of the Horse, a highly prestigious position that required him to be physically close to the Queen during all travel. It was a position that allowed him to whisper in her ear while they rode through the forests of Windsor. The courtiers watched with a mixture of amusement and alarm. They saw the late-night card games. They saw the way the Queen's eyes followed him around the room. They saw the way Essex would turn cold if the Queen spoke to another man, forcing her to coax him back into a good mood with gifts and titles. It was a dangerous game. Essex was treating the Queen of England like a girlfriend. He was testing boundaries that no one had dared to test for 30 years. In 1587, he staged a scene of jealousy that became legendary. The Queen had shown favor to Charles Blount, a handsome young soldier, by giving him a gold chess queen to wear on his arm. Essex, seeing this, sneered, "Now I perceive every fool must have a favor." Blount challenged him to a duel. They met in Marylebone Park. Blount wounded Essex in the thigh. When the Queen heard about the duel, she didn't punish them. She laughed. She reportedly said, "By God's death, it is fit that someone or other should take him down and teach him better manners. Otherwise, there will be no rule with him." She enjoyed two young men fighting over her. It validated her femininity. It proved that despite the wrinkles and the wigs, she was still the prize. But beneath the laughter, a seed of resentment was planted. Essex believed he was fighting for his honor. Elizabeth believed he was fighting for her amusement. He thought he was the protagonist. She knew he was the pet. This fundamental misunderstanding, the gap between who Essex thought he was and who Elizabeth allowed him to be, would widen until it swallowed them both. As the year 1588 approached, the sky darkened over England. The Spanish Armada was coming. The great showdown between Catholic Spain and Protestant England was at hand. Essex was desperate for a command. He wanted to be the hero who saved England. He commissioned a suit of armor. He gathered his followers. He prepared to ride to the coast to repel the invaders. But the Queen forbade it. She would not risk his life. While other men, Drake, Raleigh, Hawkins, sailed out to meet the Spanish fleet, Essex was kept at Tilbury Camp. Safe by the Queen's side, he was forced to walk behind her horse while she gave her famous speech to the troops. He was the master of the horse, effectively a glorified groom, while other men became legends. It ate him alive. He realized that the Queen's love was a cage. She loved him too much to let him be a man. She wanted him to be an ornament. When the Armada was defeated, England rejoiced. But Essex seethed. He had missed the greatest war of his generation. He determined then and there that he would never again be kept on a leash. If the Queen wouldn't give him a war, he would find one. The death of his stepfather, the Earl of Leicester, shortly after the Armada victory, removed the last restraining hand from Essex's shoulder. Leicester had been the only man who could tell Essex to sit down and shut up. With Leicester gone, Essex was now the undisputed favorite. He was 23 years old, untethered and hungry for glory. He began to build his own spy network, rivaling that of the Ceciles. He began to correspond with the King of Scotland, James VI, the likely successor to the throne. He began to cultivate an image as the champion of the Puritan cause, the sword of Protestantism. He was constructing a persona that was bigger than the Queen. He was becoming a populist leader, and in the shadows of the court, the quiet, hunchbacked figure of Robert Cecil watched and waited and began to take notes. The stage was set for the tragic second act of the drama, the years of glory and the beginning of the madness. Indeed, Essex had no patience for a slow-burning drama. He refused to be a mere player in Cecil's long game of chess. He wanted to kick over the board. The court of England had become a cage of velvet and whispers, too small to contain his restless ambition. Driven by a need to prove he was more than just the Queen's lapdog, he decided to shatter the protocols of the court and hurl himself into the one arena where blood mattered more than bureaucracy. The sea was rough, churning with the same restlessness that plagued the young Earl's heart. Robert Devereux was doing something that no favorite, no courtier, and certainly no subject of Elizabeth I was ever supposed to do. He was running away to war. Following the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, England had launched a counterstrike, known as the English Armada or the Drake Norris Expedition. It was a massive, chaotic venture aimed at destroying the remnants of the Spanish fleet and placing a pretender, Don Antonio, on the Portuguese throne. The Queen had invested heavily in it, but she had issued one strict command. The Earl of Essex was to stay home. He was too valuable, too pretty, and too essential to her emotional well-being to be risked in the grime of a foreign trench. Essex ignored her. In a move that foreshadowed the reckless abandon of his final years, he slipped away from the court in disguise. He rode furiously to the coast, commandeered a ship, the Swiftsure, and sailed out to join the fleet, leaving the Queen a letter that was half apology, half manifesto. He wrote that he would rather live an hour of glory than a lifetime of sluggish ease. When Elizabeth found out, she was incensed. She sent pinnaces racing after him with orders to arrest him and drag him back. But Essex was already gone, lost in the fog of war. He joined the expedition off the coast of Portugal. For a few weeks, he lived the life he had dreamed of reading about in his Roman histories. He was the first man ashore at Peniche, wading through the surf with a pike in his hand, the water crashing around his waist, leading his men up the beach into Spanish fire. At Lisbon, he thrust his pike into the wooden gates of the city and challenged the Spanish commander to single combat. It was glorious. It was chivalric. It was also utterly useless. The expedition was a strategic failure. Thousands of English soldiers died of disease and starvation. The Spanish held Lisbon, but for Essex, the reality of the failure didn't matter. The image was what counted. He returned to England not as a naughty boy who had disobeyed his mother, but as a war hero who had thrust his pike into the enemy's gate. The Queen predictably forgave him. She was angry, yes, but her relief at seeing him alive overwhelmed her discipline. She scolded him, then embraced him. This pattern, transgression followed by emotional blackmail followed by forgiveness, was now the established rhythm of their relationship. Essex learned the wrong lesson. He learned that he was untouchable. If the escape to Portugal was a professional betrayal, what happened next was a personal one. By 1590, Essex was the undisputed son around which the court revolved. But a man of 25 needs more than the platonic affection of a woman pushing 60. Essex had needs. He had debts. And he had an eye for a specific kind of woman. He fell in love with Frances Walsingham. Frances was a woman of tragic pedigree. She was the daughter of Francis Walsingham, the Queen's legendary spymaster, the man who had caught Mary, Queen of Scots. She was also the widow of Sir Philip Sidney, the poet-soldier who was the beau ideal of the Elizabethan age. By marrying her, Essex was symbolically stepping into Sidney's shoes, claiming the mantle of the ultimate Protestant knight. But there was a problem. The Queen hated her favorites marrying. To marry was to declare that the Queen was not enough. It was to admit that the Virgin Queen was an old woman who could not provide a family or sexual fulfillment. It shattered the illusion of the courtly romance. Essex knew this. So he married Frances in secret. For months they hid the union. Frances lived in the shadows, terrified of the royal wrath. But in the Tudor court, secrets had a shelf life of days, not months. When Frances became visibly pregnant, the truth came out. Elizabeth's rage was nuclear. This wasn't just disobedience, it was infidelity. She felt made a fool of. She screamed that there was no such thing as a secret sin. She banished Frances from court, refusing to lay eyes on the she-wolf who had stolen her robin. For weeks, Essex was in the wilderness, but he played his cards with a cold, manipulative precision. He knew the Queen needed him. He knew she was bored by the gray men in suits, the Cecils who ran the government. She needed his color, his noise, his drama. He wrote her letters of abject misery. He described his solitude and his sorrow. Eventually the Queen cracked. She allowed him back. But she never forgave Frances. For the rest of Essex's life, his wife was a ghost, kept in the country, hidden away like a shameful secret, while Essex played the bachelor at court, dancing with the Queen as if he had no ring on his finger. It was a toxic compromise. It taught Essex that he could have his cake and eat it too, provided he was willing to emotionally manipulate an old woman. With his domestic life settled in the shadows, Essex turned his eyes to the real prize: power. The death of Francis Walsingham in 1590 had left the position of principal secretary vacant. This was the most powerful job in the government, the gatekeeper to the Queen, the handler of intelligence. Essex wanted the job for his friend, William Davison. The Cecils wanted it for Robert Cecil. It was here that the great rivalry truly began. Robert Cecil was everything Essex was not. Small, hunched, he suffered from scoliosis, and physically weak, he was often mocked by Essex, who called him Robert the Devil or the Crookback. But Cecil possessed a mind like a diamond, hard, sharp, and unbreakable. While Essex was dancing, Cecil was reading dossiers. While Essex was hunting stags, Cecil was hunting traitors. Essex decided that if he couldn't beat the Cecils with bureaucracy, he would beat them with intelligence. He would become the Queen's spy master. He hired Anthony Bacon, brother of the famous Francis Bacon, to build a network of agents across Europe. He spent a fortune paying informants in Spain, France, and Italy. He wanted to prove to the Queen that he knew more about the world than the dusty old men at the council table. In 1594, his efforts bore poisonous fruit in the Dr. Lopez affair. Rodrigo Lopez was the Queen's personal physician. He was a Portuguese Jew, a converso, who had served Elizabeth faithfully for years. He was a skilled doctor and a trusted servant. But Essex needed a win. He needed a conspiracy to crush. His agents intercepted letters that seemed to suggest Lopez was in contact with the Spanish court. Essex jumped on it. He interrogated Lopez himself. He accused the doctor of plotting to poison the Queen. The Queen was skeptical. She liked Lopez. She called Essex a rash and temerarious youth for making such wild accusations without proof. Essex was humiliated. He went to his room and fell into a fit of melancholy for 2 days, refusing to eat. This was his trump card, emotional manipulation. The Queen, terrified that her favorite was ill, relented. She allowed him to pursue the investigation. Essex turned the screws. He had Lopez moved to the Tower. Under the threat of the rack and perhaps the application of it, Lopez confessed to everything and nothing. He admitted he had spoken to the Spanish, but claimed he was trying to swindle them out of money, not kill the Queen. It didn't matter. Essex whipped up a frenzy of anti-Semitic paranoia in London. He painted himself as the savior who had uncovered the viper. In the Queen's bosom, Lopez was condemned. On June 7, 1594, the old doctor was dragged to Tyburn. As he stood on the scaffold, he cried out that he loved the Queen as well as he loved Jesus Christ. The crowd, knowing his Jewish heritage, roared with cruel laughter. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Essex had his victory. He had proved he was a player, but it was a victory bought with blood and lies. It showed a darkening of his character. The chivalric knight was learning the dirty arts of the police state. If the Lopez affair was Essex's moral low point, 1596 was his zenith. The war with Spain was heating up again. Intelligence reports suggested the Spanish were building a new armada in the port of Cadiz. This time, the Queen agreed to a preemptive strike. She appointed a joint command. The Lord Admiral Howard would command the ships. The Earl of Essex would command the soldiers. It was a massive fleet, 150 ships, thousands of men. As they sailed toward Spain, Essex was in ecstasy. This was his element. He wrote to the council, "I shall either return with glory or not return at all." On June 20th, they arrived at Cadiz. The Spanish fleet was trapped in the bay. The English commanders held a council of war. The prudent thing to do was to bombard from a distance. Essex voted to attack. He threw his hat into the sea in a gesture of pure joy when the order was given to advance. The battle was a massacre. The English ships smashed into the Spanish galleons. The great Spanish flagship, the San Felipe, ran aground and blew up, sending a mushroom cloud of timber and bodies into the sky. Essex didn't wait for the naval battle to finish. He landed his troops on the sandy beach south of the city. The Spanish cavalry charged them. Essex, laughing, ordered his men to hold fire until the horses were almost on top of them, then unleashed a volley that shattered the charge. He drew his sword and led the run toward the city walls. He was the first over the ramparts, or close enough to claim it. The city of Cadiz fell in hours. What followed was a sack, but a strangely civilized one. Essex, mindful of his reputation as a Christian knight, ordered that women and priests were not to be touched. He treated the captured Spanish nuns with elaborate courtesy, arranging safe passage for them. He was playing the role of Alexander the Great, conqueror and gentleman. He returned to England a superstar. The psychological impact of Cadiz cannot be overstated. When Essex walked the streets of London, people cheered. They reached out to touch his stirrups. Poets wrote ballads about him. He grew a square-cut beard, the Cadiz beard, and suddenly every young man in England was wearing it. He was more than a nobleman, he was a celebrity. But at court, the temperature dropped. While Essex had been away playing hero, Robert Cecil had been appointed principal secretary. The job Essex had wanted for his friend was now in the hands of his enemy. And the Queen? She was happy about the victory, but she was furious about the loot. Essex had allowed the soldiers to plunder the city, but he had failed to secure the Spanish treasure ships for the crown. The expedition had cost her a fortune, and she saw very little return on investment. When Essex burst into her presence, glowing with pride, she asked him, "Where is my money?" It was a cold shower. Essex argued that the glory of England was worth more than gold. Elizabeth, who had to pay for the gunpowder and the beef, disagreed. Hubris is a subtle poison. After Cadiz, Essex believed he was infallible. He convinced the Queen to authorize another massive expedition in 1597, the Islands Voyage. The goal was to intercept the Spanish treasure fleet in the Azores. It was a fiasco from start to finish. The weather was atrocious. The fleet was scattered by storms. Essex, a brilliant leader of men on land, was a mediocre admiral at best. He lacked the seamanship of a Drake or the navigational genius of a Raleigh. Speaking of Raleigh, the tension between the two men exploded during this voyage. At the island of Fayal, Essex was delayed. Raleigh, arriving first, waited for his commander. When the Spanish opened fire, Raleigh lost patience and attacked without Essex. He captured the town brilliantly. When Essex arrived and saw the English flag already flying, Raleigh's flag, he went berserk. He felt upstaged. His sycophants whispered that Raleigh had done it to humiliate him. Essex actually threatened to court-martial and execute Raleigh for insubordination. It took Lord Thomas Howard to physically step between them and calm Essex down. They missed the treasure fleet. It slipped past them in the fog, carrying millions of ducats to Spain. Essex returned to England empty-handed, seasick, and angry. He found that in his absence the Queen had promoted Lord Howard to the Earldom of Nottingham, making him technically superior in rank to Essex. Essex exploded. He refused to come to court. He refused to do his duty. He stayed in his house brooding in sullen silence, claiming he was sick of the world. The Queen, exhausted by his tantrums, eventually compromised. She made Essex the Earl Marshal of England, a title that restored his precedence. But the dynamic had shifted. She was no longer charmed by his petulance. She was weary of it. She was beginning to see him not as a dashing young knight, but as a destabilizing force, a man who put his own ego above the good of the state. The breaking point, the moment that historians point to as the beginning of the end, came in July 1598. The setting was the Privy Council chamber. It was a hot summer day. The topic was Ireland. The Lord Deputy of Ireland had died, and the council was debating who to send to that graveyard of reputations. The Queen wanted to send Sir William Knollys, Essex's uncle. She thought he was safe and reliable. Essex disagreed. He wanted to send Sir George Carew, not because he thought Carew would do a good job, but because he hated Carew and wanted him out of the country. The argument grew heated. The Queen, tired of Essex's constant contrarianism, dismissed his suggestion sharply. Then, Essex did the unthinkable. In a moment of supreme aristocratic arrogance, he turned his back on the Queen. It was a gesture of total contempt. You do not turn your back on the monarch. It was a denial of her authority, her dignity, and her person. Elizabeth I was the daughter of Henry VIII. She had survived the Tower, the plots of Mary Queen of Scots, and the Spanish Armada. She was not a woman to be physically disrespected by a subject she had raised from nothing. She stood up, her eyes black with rage. She shouted, "Go and be hanged!" And she boxed his ears. It was a hard, stinging slap, the kind a mother gives an insolent child. The room froze. The scratching of the clerk's quills stopped. Essex's face went crimson. In a blind reflex of fury, his hand flew to his hip. He half drew his sword. The Lord Admiral threw himself in front of Essex. The Queen stood her ground, staring him down. Essex shouted, his voice cracking with rage, that he would not have taken such an insult from King Henry VIII himself. He called it a base and servile condition, to serve a woman who ruled by passion rather than reason. He stormed out of the room. It was treason. Drawing a weapon in the presence of the monarch was a capital offense. Insulting the Queen's gender and her father was political suicide. He fled to his estates. For weeks the court waited for his arrest, but the arrest never came. The Queen, in her weakness, still loved him, or perhaps she feared him. He was the hero of the people, the leader of the army. Arresting him might spark a civil war. So, an uneasy standoff began. Essex refused to apologize. He wrote letters to his friends complaining about the mind of a woman being the supreme authority. But as the months dragged on, Essex realized a terrifying truth. He needed the Queen more than she needed him. His debts were mounting. His influence was waning. The Cecils were running the country smoothly without him. He eventually crawled back. He offered a sullen apology. The Queen accepted it, but the warmth was gone. The sweet Robin was dead. In his place was a dangerous, brooding wolf. And just across the Irish Sea, a real wolf was waiting. Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, had raised a massive rebellion. He was crushing English armies. Ireland was in flames. The Queen needed a general. Essex needed a way to restore his glory. Fate was about to hand him the very thing he wanted, and the very thing that would kill him. And so the trap was baited with the very thing Essex craved: supreme command. He had bullied his way into the Lord Lieutenancy, believing he could tame the Irish wilderness with the same ease he had charmed the court. But as he sailed across the Irish Sea, he was leaving the world of chivalric romance and entering a brutal reality of guerrilla warfare. The theoretical hero was about to meet the practical nightmare of the Irish bog. The wind in Ireland was different. It didn't brace you like the salt air of the English Channel. It seeped into you, carrying the scent of peat smoke, rotting vegetation, and impending disaster. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, stood on Irish soil as the Lord Lieutenant. He was 33 years old. He was at the head of the largest army ever to leave English shores during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. 16,000-foot soldiers and 1,300 cavalry. It was a force that should have terrified the world. It was a sledgehammer designed to crack a nut. But the nut was Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, and he was not waiting to be cracked. O'Neill was a ghost, educated in England, raised in the household of the Sidneys. O'Neill knew the English mind better than they knew themselves. He knew Essex's reputation, a man of dashing cavalry charges and open-field chivalry. So, O'Neill decided he would never give Essex a battlefield. He would give him a bog. The mission was clear: march north to Ulster, smash O'Neill's main force, end the rebellion, return home a hero. But from the moment Essex landed in Dublin, the strange lethargy that had plagued him in recent years took hold. Instead of marching north to the heart of the rebellion, he listened to the local Irish council, men who were terrified, self-interested, and corrupt. They advised him that the northern army was too strong, the cattle too scarce, the grass not yet grown for the horses. They told him to go south first, to secure Leinster and Munster. It was a trap, and Essex walked right into it. He spent the spring and summer of 1599 marching his magnificent army in circles through the southern counties. It was a nightmare campaign. The Irish rebels didn't fight. They picked. They ambushed supply lines. They sniped from the tree lines. They lured English heavy cavalry into plashed forests, woods where the branches were woven together to create impassable barriers, and then slaughtered them. Disease did the rest. Dysentery, the country sickness, swept through the camp. Men died by the hundreds, vomiting their lives away in the mud. The English soldiers, unpaid and ill-fed, began to desert, and Essex, he was unraveling. He wrote letters home that were manic in their despair. "I am defeated in my heart," he wrote to the Queen. He complained about the rain, the food, the people. He blamed everyone but himself. To maintain the loyalty of his officers, he began to use the only currency he had left: honor. In a flagrant abuse of his authority, Essex began knighting men on an industrial scale. Knighthood was supposed to be a rare honor bestowed by the sovereign for exceptional valor. Essex treated it like a party favor. He knighted drinking buddies, middling officers, and men who had done nothing more than survive a skirmish. By the end of the campaign, he had created 81 knights. When news reached London, Elizabeth was apoplectic. "My Lord General has become a king in all but name," she raged. He was building a private constituency, a brotherhood of men loyal to him, not to the crown. By August, the Queen had had enough. She sent a blistering letter, ordering Essex to march north and fight O'Neill immediately. "We've paid you to fight, not to tour," was the essence of the message. Reluctantly, Essex gathered the remnants of his great army. Of the 17,000 men he had arrived with, only about 4,000 were fit for duty. He marched north toward the border of Ulster. He found O'Neill waiting for him. But O'Neill didn't offer a battle, he offered a talk. On September 7th, 1599, the two earls met at the ford of Bellaclinth on the River Lagan. It was a scene rich in symbolism. O'Neill, the rebel, rode his horse into the belly of the river, water swirling up to the saddle girth. Essex, the representative of the crown, rode down from the bank to meet him. They spoke alone for 30 minutes. No scribes, no witnesses. This was the height of folly. For a Lord Lieutenant to speak privately with an arch traitor was technically treasonous. What did they say? Rumors flew. Some said they merely discussed a ceasefire, but others whispered darker things, that O'Neill had proposed a plan where Essex would take the English throne, and O'Neill would rule a free Ireland. We will never know the truth, but the optics were damning. Essex agreed to a truce. A truce. After spending a fortune of the Queen's money and losing thousands of men, he had simply agreed to stop fighting until the spring. He turned his back on the north and returned to Dublin. In Dublin, the final blow fell. A letter arrived from the Queen. It was the coldest, most dangerous letter she had ever written him. She dissected his failures with forensic precision. She mocked his progress through the South. She questioned his sanity. But it was the subtext that terrified Essex. He knew that back in London, Robert Cecil was whispering in the Queen's ear. He imagined Cecil constructing a case for treason. He imagined the Tower. Paranoia seized him. He became convinced that if he stayed in Ireland, he would be recalled in chains. He believed, with the arrogance of a narcissist, that if he could just see the Queen, if he could just look into her eyes and use his famous charm, he could fix everything. He had always been able to talk his way out of trouble. He made a decision that would cost him his life. He decided to abandon his post. He threw his command to a subordinate. He took a select group of his new knights and boarded a ship for England. He was deserting the army in the field during a time of war. He landed in Wales and began to ride. It was a race against time. He had to reach the Queen before her spies told her he was coming. He had to surprise her. He rode like a madman. He rode through the mud of the Welsh borders, changing horses, barely sleeping. He rode through the Midlands, his small troop thundering through startled villages. On the morning of September 28, 1599, he reached the ferry at Lambeth, crossed the Thames, and galloped toward Nonsuch Palace in Surrey, where the court was residing. He arrived at 10 a.m. He was covered in mud. His boots were caked with filth. He smelled of horse sweat, stale fear, and exhaustion. At the palace gates, the guards tried to stop him. "My lord, you cannot." He pushed past them. He ran through the great hall. He ran through the presence chamber, where courtiers gasped to see the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland running like a fugitive. He ran through the privy chamber, and then he did the forbidden thing. He burst through the door of the Queen's bedchamber. To understand the horror of this moment, one must understand the cult of Elizabeth. The Queen was 66 years old. For decades, she had maintained a strict visual tyranny. No man saw her until she was ready. Being ready meant the complete construction of the icon. It meant the red wig was pinned and the porcelain mask was applied. But in this moment, the mask was absent. When Essex burst through the door, he saw Elizabeth Tudor, the woman. He saw the reality. She was standing in her dressing gown. Her gray hair hung in thin wisps around her shoulders. Her wig was on the stand. Her face was pale, lined, and sunken. She was vulnerable. She was old. Essex stopped. He fell to his knees. He grabbed her hands and began to kiss them, babbling about his love, his enemies, his need to see her. Elizabeth stood frozen. The shock was absolute. Her privacy, her carefully constructed mystery, had been violated by this mud-spattered man. But Elizabeth was a master politician. She didn't scream. She didn't call the guards. She realized that Essex was in a manic state and potentially dangerous. He had men with him downstairs. She spoke to him calmly. She asked him about his journey. She allowed him to believe he was forgiven. She told him to go and wash himself and return later. Essex left the room floating on air. He went to the apartments prepared for him, washed the mud off, changed into his finest silks, and told his friends, "I have found a sweet calm at home after much storm abroad." He thought he had won. He thought the charm had worked one last time. He was wrong. While Essex was washing, the Queen was transforming. She put on the wig, she put on the makeup, she put on the armor of Her Majesty, and she summoned Robert Cecil. When Essex returned to the Queen's presence that afternoon, the atmosphere had changed. The grandmotherly woman in the dressing gown was gone. Sitting on the chair of state was the Queen of England. She was icy. She demanded to know why he had left Ireland without permission. She demanded to know why he had made a truce with a traitor. She cut him off when he tried to speak. The trap snapped shut. That night, Essex was ordered to remain in his room. The next day, he was summoned before the Privy Council. He stood for 5 hours while they interrogated him. He was not offered a chair. On October 1st, he was committed to the custody of the Lord Keeper at York House. He was a prisoner. The fall was total. For the next year, Essex lived in a twilight world. He was stripped of his offices. He was banned from court. His friends deserted him. The fair-weather friends, as he called them, scurried back to the safety of the Seychelles. He fell into a deep depression. He wrote pathetic letters to the Queen, signing them, "Your Majesty's poor vassal." He described himself as a stranger to the world. The Queen waited. She was testing him. She wanted submission. She wanted him to admit that he was wrong, that he was not the hero, that he was her creature. But Essex had too much Boleyn blood for total submission. Even as he begged for mercy, he seethed with resentment. He began to hold secret prayer meetings at Essex House. He began to attract the discontented, the Puritan preachers who hated the bishops, the old soldiers who were unpaid, the young hotheads who felt the court was corrupt. Essex House on the Strand became a headquarters for the opposition. By late 1600, Essex was free from house arrest, but he was banished from court. He was living on borrowed time and borrowed money. His debts were astronomical, roughly £16,000, millions in today's money. He had one hope, the sweet wines monopoly. This was a tax on all sweet wines imported into England. It was Essex's main source of income. The patent for the monopoly was due to expire at Christmas 1600. Essex wrote to the Queen. It was a letter of desperation. He told her that without the monopoly he was a ruined man. He begged her to renew it not just for the money, but as a sign that she still cared for him. Elizabeth read the letter. She looked at the man who had disobeyed her, insulted her, wasted her army, and violated her bedroom. She decided it was time to break him completely. She refused to renew the monopoly. Her comment to the court was recorded, and it was brutal. An ungovernable beast must be stopped of his provender, that he may be managed. She was starving him into submission. When Essex heard the news, something in him finally snapped. The thread of sanity that had been fraying for years severed. He stopped writing apology letters. He started saying dangerous things. He told a friend that the Queen was an old woman as crooked in her mind as she is in her body. The insult was reported back to Elizabeth. It was the one thing she could never forgive. He had attacked her vanity. The doors of mercy were slammed shut. Essex House was now an armed camp. Every day swordsmen and soldiers drifted in. They sat in the great hall, drinking Essex's wine and listening to his rants. Essex was no longer thinking clearly. He was listening to the voices of extremists. There was his secretary, Henry Cuff, a brilliant but poisonous academic who told Essex that a monarch who violated the laws of God could be removed. There was his sister, Penelope Rich, the Stella of Philip Sidney's sonnets, who urged him to be a man and take what was his. And there was the Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's patron, young and reckless, who was ready for a revolution. They concocted a plan. It was a plan born of delusion. They would seize the court. They would secure the Tower. They would march on Whitehall, force their way into the Queen's presence. Not to harm her, they claimed, but to rescue her. They would remove the evil counselors, Cecil and Raleigh, and ensure that the King of Scotland, James VI, was recognized as the heir. Essex convinced himself he was acting for the good of England. He wasn't a traitor, he was a liberator. But Robert Cecil knew everything. His spies were inside Essex House. He read their letters. He counted their swords. He watched the ungovernable beast preparing to bite. On Saturday, February 7th, 1601, a group of Essex's followers crossed the river to the Globe Theatre. They found the Lord Chamberlain's men, Shakespeare's company. They offered the actors 40 shillings, a large sum, to perform a specific play the next day. The play was Richard II. It was an old play, and the actors were reluctant. It told the story of a weak king who is deposed by a strong nobleman. It included a scene where the monarch is forced to give up the crown on stage. The actors argued it was too controversial. The Queen hated the play. She had once said, "I am Richard II. Know ye not that?" But the money was good. The actors agreed. As the sun set on February 7th, the conspirators returned to Essex House. The play was set. The swords were sharpened. The sweet Robin was about to commit high treason. The sun rose on a London that was holding its breath. The air was crisp, the streets quiet with a Sabbath calm. But inside the walls of Essex House, the atmosphere was electric, with the chaotic energy of a desperate gamble. About 200 men had gathered in the courtyard. It was a motley collection of the disaffected, bankrupt knights, Puritan zealots, old soldiers from the Irish wars, and young aristocrats drunk on the romance of revolution. They wore no armor. There hadn't been time, but they were armed with rapiers, daggers, and pistols. At 10 a.m., a knocking at the great gate shattered the tension. It was not the army. It was a delegation from the Queen. 4 of the most dignified men in England stood there: the Lord Keeper Egerton, the Earl of Worcester, Sir William Knollys, Essex's own uncle, and the Lord Chief Justice Popham. They had come to offer Essex a final chance. They commanded the gates be opened. Essex let them in, but he kept his wild mob of followers back. The 4 dignitaries walked into the courtyard, their long velvet robes sweeping the stones, surrounded by men shouting, "Kill them! Kill them! Cast the Great Seal out the window!" Lord Keeper Egerton raised his voice. He asked Essex what was the meaning of this assembly. He promised that if Essex had grievances, the Queen would hear them. "Disband this company," Egerton urged, "and come with us to the court." For a moment, Essex hesitated. This was the off-ramp. He could go with them, claim he was afraid for his life, and beg for mercy. But the mob behind him was screaming, "They betray you, my lord. They betray you." Essex made his choice. He turned to the 4 counselors and said, "I will go into the city to take order with the mayor and sheriffs. You shall stay here." He herded the Queen's representatives, the highest legal authorities in the land, into his library. He locked the door. He turned to his men and shouted, "Guard them with your lives." He had just taken the government hostage. There was no turning back now. At 11 a.m., the gates of Essex House swung open. Essex rode out, flanked by the Earls of Southampton, Rutland, and Bedford. Behind them streamed 200 swordsmen. They turned left, heading toward the city of London. Essex's plan relied on one crucial assumption, that the people of London loved him. He believed that once they saw him, the apprentices, the shopkeepers, and the militia would rise up, grab their pikes, and join his crusade against the evil counselors. He rode up Fleet Street, shouting his battle cry, "For the Queen, for the Queen, a plot is laid for my life." He cried out that Lord Cobham and Walter Raleigh were planning to murder him. He shouted that the crown was being sold to the Spanish Infanta. But as he rode, a terrible thing happened. Nothing. The people came to their windows. They stood in the doorways of the taverns. They watched. They recognized him. They tipped their hats. Some even cheered, "God save your lordship," but nobody joined him. Not a single apprentice picked up a club. Not a single militiaman grabbed a pike. The citizens of London were practical people. They liked Essex. He was a celebrity, but they loved the Queen, and they feared the law. They looked at this sweating, shouting nobleman and saw not a savior, but a man having a breakdown. The silence of the streets was deafening. It was the sound of reality crashing into Essex's fantasy. He reached the house of Sheriff Smythe on Fenchurch Street. Smythe had promised to support him with 1,000 men. Essex burst into the house, exhausted, sweat pouring down his face. "Where are your men?" he demanded. Smythe, seeing that Essex was alone and the city was quiet, panicked. He stammered an excuse, said he had to go consult the mayor, and slipped out the back door. Essex waited and waited. While he sat in the sheriff's house wiping his brow, the government struck back. In Whitehall, the Queen was calm. When told of the rebellion, she reportedly said she would go out to face them herself, to see if any rebel of them all durst show their faces against me. She was not afraid. She ordered the heralds into the city. At 2 p.m., a herald rode into Cheapside. He blew his trumpet. He unrolled a scroll. He proclaimed Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, a traitor. The word hung in the air. The spectators melted away. To be near a traitor was to risk death. Essex heard the proclamation. He left Sheriff Smythe's house, his face pale. He realized the game was up. "We must return to Essex House," he told his dwindling band. "We must hold the hostages." They tried to retrace their steps, but the way was blocked. At Ludgate, the Bishop of London had deployed a company of pikemen and musketmen. Essex charged them. It was a brief, desperate skirmish. Shots rang out. Sir Christopher Blount, Essex's stepfather, was shot in the cheek. A young page standing next to Essex was killed. Essex's hat was shot through. They couldn't break the line. Defeated, Essex turned and ran toward the river. He found a boat at Queenhithe and rowed frantically back to Essex House. He arrived to find his last bargaining chip gone. While he was away, a loyal servant, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, had released the hostages. Essex was trapped. He began to burn his papers. He burned a black bag containing letters from the King of Scotland. He and his remaining followers, now only a handful, barricaded the doors. By 5 p.m., the Queen's artillery had arrived. The Lord Admiral Howard, the man who had sailed with Essex to Cadiz, now trained cannons on his front door. He gave Essex an ultimatum: surrender, or we blow the house down. Essex went to the roof. He looked out at the city that had rejected him. He looked at the river that had carried him to so many adventures. At 10 o'clock p.m., he surrendered. He handed over his sword. He was led out into the night, illuminated by the torches of his captors, and taken to the Tower of London. 10 days later, the Earl of Essex stood trial for high treason. Westminster Hall was packed. The peers of the realm sat on benches covered in red cloth. The Lord Treasurer Buckhurst presided. Essex was dressed in black. He looked tired, but his arrogance had returned. He treated the trial not as a legal proceeding, but as a debate he intended to win. The evidence was overwhelming. He had imprisoned the Lord Keeper. He had marched under arms. He had incited rebellion, but Essex fought back. He claimed he had no intent to harm the Queen, only to remove her evil counselors. He pointed a finger at Robert Cecil, accusing him of selling the country to Spain. Suddenly, a dramatic moment occurred. Robert Cecil, who had been listening from behind a curtain, stepped out. He fell to his knees before the court and demanded to be heard. He challenged Essex to name one witness, one proof, that he had ever plotted with Spain. Essex faltered. He had nothing. It was a rumor he had started, and now it evaporated in the light of the courtroom. Then came the cruelest cut. The prosecution brought out their star lawyer. It was Francis Bacon. Bacon was Essex's friend. Essex had patronized him, given him land, fought for his promotion. Bacon had been one of the intellectuals in Essex's circle, but Bacon was a survivor. Seeing the ship sinking, he had switched sides. Now he used his brilliance to destroy his former patron. He compared Essex to the Duke of Guise. He tore apart Essex's defense, arguing that to pin the sovereign is to kill the sovereign. He argued that no subject can force their way to the monarch with a sword without implying a threat to the monarch's life. Essex looked at Bacon with a mixture of disbelief and pity. "I call forth Mr. Bacon against Mr. Bacon," he said, reminding the court of letters Bacon had written supporting him. But it didn't matter. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The peers voted one by one. Each stood up, placed a hand on his heart, and said, "Guilty, my lord, upon my honor." Even Essex's best friend, the Earl of Southampton, was found guilty, though his life would eventually be spared. When the death sentence was read, hanging, drawing, and quartering, Essex did not flinch. He said, "I think it fitting that my poor quarters, which have done Her Majesty true service in divers parts of the world, should be sacrificed and disposed of at Her Majesty's pleasure." He asked only one thing, that he be executed privately inside the tower, not hacked apart before the mob. In the days between the sentence and the execution, Essex's resolve crumbled. The Queen sent her own chaplain to him. The chaplain played on Essex's conscience. He told Essex that he was going to hell unless he confessed everything. He told him that his pride was a sin that was damning his soul. Essex broke. The martyr persona dissolved. He became a frightened man desperate for absolution. He called for the scribe. And then he did something unforgivable. He named names. He dictated a confession that implicated everyone. He named his associates in Scotland. He named his friends. Worst of all, he accused his own sister, Penelope Rich. "She must be looked to," he told the council, "for she hath a proud spirit." He claimed she had incited him to the rebellion. He threw his sister to the wolves to save his own soul. It was a pathetic end to a life based on the code of chivalry. In his final hours, the perfect knight betrayed the damsel. We return to where we began. February 25th, 1601, the three blows of the axe, the cannon firing. When Queen Elizabeth heard the cannon, she did not weep, at least not publicly. She went about her business. She danced. She played music. She showed the world that she was the daughter of Henry VIII, made of steel. But those close to her saw the truth. The light had gone out of her. Robert Devereux had been her youth. He had been the last link to the romantic, impossible world she had built. Without him, she was just a lonely old woman surrounded by bureaucrats. She stopped caring for her appearance. She stopped eating. She would sit for hours, staring at nothing. 2 years later, in March 1603, the Queen died. She died in her sleep, having refused to go to bed for days, standing on her feet until she collapsed, as if terrified that if she lay down she would never get up. With her death, the Tudor dynasty ended. King James VI of Scotland, the man Essex had plotted with, rode south to claim the throne. In a final twist of irony, one of James's first acts was to release the Earl of Southampton from the Tower and restore the Devereux family to their titles. Essex's son, the third Earl of Essex, would grow up to lead the parliamentary army against King Charles I in the Civil War. The father had failed to break the monarchy. The son would help destroy it. Robert Devereux, second Earl of Essex, sleeps in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London, alongside Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. He remains one of history's great what-ifs. He was a man of immense talent, charisma, and courage. He had the world at his feet, but he lacked the one thing that Elizabeth and I possessed in abundance: self-control. He was the Icarus of the Elizabethan age. He flew too close to the sun, intoxicated by his own brilliance, and forgot that the wax of his wings was held together only by the favor of a queen. When he fell, he didn't just lose his life, he shattered the illusion of the golden age. He revealed the cracks in the system, the discontent of the people, and the fragility of the crown. The executioner's axe at Tower Green didn't just kill a man, it severed the Renaissance from the modern world. The age of knights was over. The age of revolutions was about to begin.